So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to HFA Speaks, Holding On to History, our panel in honor of National History Preservation Month. I'm Claire Yakubowski. I'm a graduating communication major, part of the Division of Humanities and Fine Arts Web and Social Media intern team, and I'll be guiding today's conversation as we explore the power, ethics, and urgency of preserving history. HFA Speaks are discussion panel events put on by the HFA team. They've been going on for about 5 years now to showcase the faculty and students here at UCSB. This year, we chose the theme Holding On to History in honor of National History Preservation Month because in this time in history, we are witnessing rapid cultural, political, and technological shifts that threaten to obscure or rewrite the past. With misinformation on the rise, marginalized voices still fighting to be heard, and physical records and sites increasingly at risk due to underfunding, preserving history accurately and inclusively is more critical than ever. We are so thrilled to be joined by three incredible panelists whose work spans centuries, continents, and mediums, all with a shared commitment to making history more inclusive and accessible. So first, we have Professor John Majewski, a historian who teaches and writes about 19th century U.S. history, focusing on slavery, political economy, and the Civil War. His current projects include Robert Glenn's Many Journeys, which reconstructs the life of an enslaved child through archival records, and Inventing the Creative Citizen, which explores how ideas about creativity and capitalism helped to shape sectional tensions leading up to the Civil War. Welcome, Professor Majewski. Next, we are joined by Professor Juan Cobo Betancourt, a historian of colonial Latin America and an expert in digital public history. His work focuses on the history of indigenous peoples in what is now Colombia. Through his nonprofit, Neo Granadina, and the Archives, Memory, and Preservation Lab at UCSB, he's helped digitize and make thousands of colonial era documents accessible to the public worldwide. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Cobo.
Thank you.
And finally, we're so excited to have with us student activist and media producer Rosie Boltman. Ms. Boltman is a history of public policy major and Black Studies minor who uses media to tell stories of justice and resistance. She hosts the People's Program on KCSB Radio, and her recent documentary, The Takeover, about the founding of UCSB's Black Studies Department, has received international recognition. Thank you so much for being here, Ms. Boltman.
Thank you guys so much. I'm super excited to be here.
So, with that, without any further ado, let's begin our conversation. I'm going to go to Professor Majewski first. We know that your work focuses a lot on memory, especially when it comes to slavery and the Civil War. So, how do you think the way that we remember and talk about the past is changing how people see American history today?
Yeah, so I guess it's a great question, and it all I think revolves around who the we is, and in many cases, and so kind of like the memory of slavery and the Civil War is always contested. There have been conservative voices, who tended to lean more towards the Confederacy and sometimes overtly pro-Confederate, that have tried to distill one particular memory of the Civil War and slavery. And then there has been many other voices, such as Black Americans, who have heavily contested those interpretations. And I think today we're in one of these moments where we're in a period of reaction. And so I've been working on a project, the Robert Glenn Project, trying to explore his world as an elderly, formerly enslaved man in Raleigh, North Carolina in the 1930s. And it's pretty stunning how the official narratives and the way the Civil War was thought about and the way the Confederacy was thought about in segregated North Carolina share similarities with the way the Trump administration self-consciously thinks about history and the way we should view history. And so there is this focus on unity, a focus on patriotism, a focus on economic progress, where slavery is either kind of forgotten about, or slavery is portrayed in nostalgic terms. And nostalgia, in some ways, is a form of forgetting, right? Where you kind of turn the brutal realities of the past into kind of saccharine, memories designed to ignore the past or make people feel good about the past. And so I really think that today is a really difficult moment, and it's a really difficult moment for historians as we try to kind of grapple with this very explicit resurgence of narratives that have their origins in the Civil War period and in Reconstruction.
Right. So you mentioned it's kind of weird to think about that there's this subjectivity to history. You don't really think about that. So I want to open it up to the whole panel and ask, we often hear that we're in this post-fact era. So looking back over the past 200 years, or for the other panelists, perhaps in this moment in time, has there ever been a parallel to this, a historical parallel where facts themselves were up for debate?
Perhaps I can answer. Um, so I think that archives and historical information and kind of remnants of the past have always been sites of negotiation, have always been sites of imagining um, the present that we're in, of making sense of the present, and also of imagining the future. So I think that um, we're very used to thinking about, John and I has taught history for a long time, and the one of the kind of the really central ideas that we kind of try to teach our students is the difference between perhaps what we think of as the past, right, and history. So the past, everything that happened until now, and history, what historians and what other people kind of make sense of this and kind of write about it. And that's constantly changing, and that's constantly changing because we approach that past, those facts, those ideas, those remnants in different ways, and that's constantly being contested and so on. And then if you add on top of that the question of kind of who has access to information, who gets to decide what is preserved, gets to decide what is made accessible, what can be in this historical record, then we also begin to very powerfully shape whose stories get to be told and whose are silenced. And so I think that there is a way in which this has always been the case. But we're certainly seeing now is the kind of moment where we're becoming more and more aware of this kind of thing, perhaps.
I want to add on to that kind of from a political and a journalistic perspective. I think that while it's true, facts have always been up for debate, and there have been concerted efforts by powerful entities. I'm speaking mostly within the US, to not have facts come to light. I had a conversation in high school that really shaped me as a journalist with the former producer of 60 Minutes, Lowell Bergman. And he told me about a segment that he wanted to do about cigarettes and how they caused cancer, and how his producers at CBS didn't want him to do the segment because they got advertising money from the cigarette and tobacco industry. So he had to dilute that story down. He had to fight to even do it. And I think things like that have always existed, but right now we exist in a period and a time where information is so abundant, where you can see what war looks like. We talked about the Vietnam War as like the living room war because you could see it on TV, and now conflicts like the genocide in Gaza and other conflicts around the world are even more intimate because they're on our phones. They're next to pictures of our childhood friends when we're scrolling on Instagram. And on top of that, on top of kind of this social media aspect and this accessibility to our world conflicts, we also just know more about things like climate change, for instance, than we did 50 years ago. And I do think there is a very explicit effort being carried out by not only the Trump administration, but a lot of conservative leaders in the United States now to discredit what should be very reliable information, what should be information everybody takes seriously and everybody takes as fact, not only because certain experts and scientists and academics are telling you that it's true over and over, and the internet and social media gives you access to those people, but also because the internet gives you access to people who are undergoing a genocide. These things are right in front of our face. And so I think that while when you look at history, there has always been a manipulation of the truth. right now we are experiencing such an egregious example of that. It's worth, highlighting in panels like these.
Right. I love that you mentioned the administration trying to discredit right now. That's what they're going for. So I'd love to ask again, Ms. Boltman. It's often said that journalists are the ones that write the first draft of history. However, recently, President Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, referred to the White House briefings as influencer briefings and excluded wire services like AP News. So, how do you see this infringement on journalistic integrity affecting the practice of documenting history?
Yeah, I think that the the actions taken by the Trump administration to shut journalists out of their press room is incredibly telling, not only because they're overturning a 70-year precedent of allowing whoever, basically all of the notable press entities into the White House press room, but because they're actively kind of like condemning these organizations. Um, Journalism is so essential. And it's kind of something I learned as being a history student, somebody who's gone through the KCSB archives and gotten this intimate look at a local history source, and as a journalist. Um, Old newspaper articles are some of the best historical sources. And I think that what's going on now with Trump and his administration dictating basically the only people that can get into his press room and ask him questions are people that are going to promote his propaganda, which means that journalists have fewer opportunities to poke holes in logic, to challenge propaganda coming out from the Trump administration. You won't see those clips anymore. I know, like last year, a lot of more progressive journalists would grill the Biden administration about sending more arms to Israel. And you would get these moments of the press secretary or the defense secretary getting kind of jumbled up. And those things speak to people. Those things provide a counter narrative that's really necessary to administrative propaganda. And we're just not getting that. And so that kind of is impacting people in the present, but it's also going to impact people in the future who are trying to see, okay, who were the dissidents? Who were the people in the room questioning the Trump administration? And how did the Trump administration respond to critique? That's just not a history that's as easily told anymore because journalists from AP News, from Reuters, are having to rely on secondhand information that they can't directly engage with. And so it's a sacrifice that they're kind of orchestrating that's going to impact historians in the future. I will say the good thing is that this effort is being litigated against the AP News. At least they and maybe others are litigating against this decision to exclude them from Trump's press room. So hopefully things will change soon and we'll only have a brief lapse in that sort of history.
Thank you so much, Ms. Boltman. I'd like to stay in the same vein of current-ish events. In December 2023, Jacksonville removed the tribute to the women of the Southern Confederacy monument. And these kind of removals are controversial. People either see them as progress or erasure. So I'd like to go back to Professor Majewski. I want to know, how should we navigate these tensions surrounding these historical monuments?
Yeah, so there are these monuments, statues erected to glorify the Confederacy. And there were, hundreds built throughout the South, actually kind of like the number in the thousands. And they have like been fiercely contested, especially in the post-Floyd world, where the George Floyd uprisings resulted in a lot of these monuments being removed. So this becomes like a question, because in some ways those monuments are history. They're like a history of how we once remembered slavery and the Civil War and the Confederacy that now we no longer remember. And so they actually do have some kind of like historical value. I think the issue is that they have historical value, but they are also, self-consciously commemorating Confederacy as well. So this is not presenting, oh, this is what we once believed. They are commemorations. They were designed as a way for a community to honor what was important about its past, which was very pro-Confederate. And so I think they should be removed because we no longer hold with the Confederate past. And we find, the values of the Confederacy are antithetical to the values of the 21st century, or at least they should be. But at the same time, if they do have historical value as like a way in which we had once remembered the past, then you can remove them to historical societies or to museums or to another site where it's more of a sense of neutrality, right? That we're not kind of commemorating this cause. We are kind of saving this a monument only so that we can remember how we once remembered in a way. And so that's what I would, I think that's been commonly done. And I think that's the right thing to do is that we don't destroy these monuments, but we move them in a way that represents this is something we study now. This is not values that we still self-consciously hold.
Well, thank you so much, panelists, for teaching us about, on a deeper level, how the past can be contested. So I'd like to turn now into how we preserve the past, which could bring us to the role of digital tools in making history more inclusive and accessible. So, Professor Kobo, I want to know, what is digital preservation and how does it help make history more inclusive?
Thank you. So I think there are a couple of things here. So on a very basic level, digital preservation is preserving digital information so that it can last, so that it can be accessed in the future. And in our current moment, one thing that we're seeing a lot is the scramble to preserve born digital information. So websites, there is a saying, there is nothing more ephemeral than a website. It can vanish in an instant, and we don't even think about it. An email, a text message, these things deleted so easily. They're so impermanent, and yet they hold so much information about our current moment. When the war in Ukraine began, there were huge efforts by scholars across the world to try to preserve websites and internet resources and so on before the servers that housed them were destroyed. And suddenly, when the Trump administration began to remove and to delete content, this also started to happen here. And a lot of scholars who had kind of cut their teeth doing this emergency digital preservation of websites and so on were well prepared to meet this challenge and have been archiving and scrambling to do this. And then there is the question of how to digitally preserve artifacts that are not born digital, that are made of paper, that are made of different materials, and which are in danger in different ways. And we do this by creating digital surrogates that we then kind of look after, or in some cases, uh, because the materials themselves are deteriorating so quickly that they're going to be unusable. And in other cases, we do this in order to broaden access very explicitly. So we photograph documents, for example, and we make them available to everyone, or to a broader sort of range of people than are able to, for example, to physically travel to an archive. And that's more the sort of work that I've been involved in. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been really interested in this question of how to make that process of digitizing actually inclusive and egalitarian, right? Because the sort of equipment and the technical kind of aspects that go into this can often serve to erect barriers. So equipment is expensive. It's something that is out of the it's something that a lot of people can't afford, especially in the global south, which are regions where I work in, especially in Latin America, where equipment is so expensive that people can't really do this, or that only wealthy or state institutions can do. And so the challenge really is, they have this enormous promise, right, to bring materials to our fingertips. So the question is, how do we prevent this great opportunity from creating new barriers or from perpetuating old inequalities, where it's still the people who have the resources who are the ones who can benefit and leapfrog and so on, and take advantage of this, and those who don't continue to be kind of left aside. So my answer has been to get together with colleagues, and over the last sort of 10 years, we've built our own equipment, we've built our own book scanners, we've built our own systems and pipelines and software and everything else to make this kind of work possible in very low resource environments. And we've worked on digitizing everything from 16th century manuscripts all the way to 20th century newspapers that document human rights violations and everything else. And then we've worked very carefully with the communities whose materials these are and who are reflected in them to think about ways of sharing them that, again, don't reproduce these same kind of patterns of inequality.
That's awesome. So you said that you get with the communities to digitize these things. What are the
Mhm.
ethical concerns that you makes you want to meet with these communities when sharing culturally sensitive artifacts?
So I think the question is one of equity and access, right? So um, the first thing to think about is that we, as I suppose, as historians, as scholars, we think of this in terms of our own experience, right? So we historians go to archives, we read materials, we write our books. If we are, decent and polite, we send the archives where we've written our books a copy. In my case, often in languages that people can't read, and then that's the end of that relationship, right? And we kind of go and we extract this information, and that's the end of it. And then maybe a few years later, our students go and do the same. And this whole kind of pattern of extraction is something that lots of us now find very, very troubling. So the first thing is thinking about how we within academia can do this in a way that is more egalitarian. So maybe we, work with people to provide them with the tools, for example, that they need to be able to do things that matter to them. But then there's a whole universe of other ways in which people use historical sources in ways that we can't often, in some cases, imagine. So archives are also resources that communities use to assert land rights, to pursue, um, uh, legal processes to contest injustice, to find ways of building their communities or adapting to a changing world. And these are all ways um, that are deeply rooted in these collections and these materials. And so really it's also kind of the humble realization that what we do as historians in looking at these materials is only a small fraction of why they're important and why they matter. And to maybe talk about to connect this a little bit with what you were discussing before, one of the archives that we digitized really when we were beginning this work in a region called Popayan, and a city called Popayan in the southwest of Colombia, um, where we worked, this is a fantastic archive. It's housed in a university. The people there are very, attuned to a lot of these questions. We digitized a whole section of this archive and shared it with people online. This is also possible thanks to the work of UCSB students who work in every aspect of this. And we published this, and a few years later, when this kind of reckoning with historical monuments and memory came to Colombia, an indigenous group from the region, the Misak, used materials from this archive that we had made available to conduct a really extraordinary legal process where they basically tried the memory of this Spanish conquistador, this conqueror, whose equestrian statue was erected in the middle of the city. And they used these archives and what is now a really, really interesting and very well studied kind of process to condemn the memory. They found him guilty of all these different things, and so they condemned his memory to oblivion. So they condemned his memory to being forgotten, and in that way they justified tearing down the statue. So we make these materials available. When we started doing this, it was very much thinking about people like us, students, scholars, and so on. And it's been a wonderful journey of learning all the different ways in which lots and lots of different people use these things. And that's what I'm trying to do now is really just to continue to learn and support communities in the way that they need to use these materials for their own purposes.
Awesome. Thank you. That was such an enlightening answer. So clearly, preserving history, archives, and access are super significant. But I also think that how the stories are told and who gets to tell them is equally significant. So piggybacking off of collaborating with the community archivists, I'd like to ask the whole panel. NPR and PBS have long partnered with historical societies and archives to tell local stories. Are you concerned about how recent funding cuts may impact these efforts?
Yeah,
Yeah.
if I could jump in here.
Please.
Again, I want to talk about both the contemporary and the historical impact of this decision. So I'm currently in a community radio station. We are not an NPR affiliate, but we are in that community of being a community-driven radio station, usually not the best funded, but that is dedicated to serving the community through news, stories, entertainment, etc. And through the recent federal funding cuts, like a lot of small PBS stations could lose between 40 and 50% of their funding, and it's similar for small NPR radio stations. And this is so important because over the past few decades, we've seen local news outlets decline, decline, and decline. And as the chief executive of NPR pointed out, 20% of Americans don't have access to any other local news source besides an NPR affiliate radio station. So this is really important. It's really important so people can take actions in their community that better their lives. Community media is important so we can understand the impact of federal and state policy. To bring up some recent examples, what's the impact of Trump's tariffs on Santa Barbara's fishing industry? That's something that we've explored here at KCSB. What is the impact of the recently approved State Farm insurance hikes on Santa Barbara residents, etc.? Those are questions that can only be answered by local media because those are the only outlets that are really, those are the only ones that really care about those questions. It would take the New York Times or national outlets a million years to cover every single little city. And so it's so imperative that we have community media in every region. But from a historical perspective, I am news director at KCSB this year, but last year I was the archives coordinator. And through parsing through our local community KCSB archives that date back to about 1962, I was able to uncover the voices and the sounds of protests that are often referenced at UCSB, but are too often kind of glossed over in terms of the details. And that those are the 1968 Black Student Union protests. And that aided in the creation of our Black Studies Department and our Ethnic Studies departments, which are some of the first in the entire country, despite UCSB being a very white school at the time that they happened. And through listening to those archives, not only was I able to get the information that I needed to produce what is now a documentary. It's screening next week. If anybody wants to come, you should check the KCSB Instagram. But it also kind of emotionally transports you to those times. That's what these audio and visual mediums are able to do. They're able to connect people with histories that either they connect to personally because they were there, like the Black alumni that saw the documentary a few weeks ago, or they help people like me connect to stories that I never would have been moved by if there wasn't a few UCSB students running around with microphones at every single BSU protest between 1968 and 1969. So it's so important that these radio stations and TV stations remain active. Again, and I'm going to say it just like I did last time, not only for current residents of communities like Santa Barbara and rural communities throughout the United States, but also for future residents of those communities.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, not only are the cuts to NPR and public radio impacting that partnership with local history, but the cuts to the National Endowment to the Humanities have a big impact on many local and state historical organizations. And so now those organizations have less money and less opportunity to kind of engage in these local initiatives to understand the past. And now we have the funding cuts from the other side that Rosie referred to that makes it more difficult to kind of tell those stories. And so it's kind of happening to kind of like both sides of that collaboration.
I could just jump in. One of the things that I've been dealing with this quarter is precisely the termination of a grant from the NEH that a few colleagues and I had managed to obtain, which was supposed to fund the production of a whole new kind of series of toolkits that we were going to give to communities, activist collectives, traditional archives and low resource environments, all manner of kind of different kind of actors who need um, access to this kind of technology to be able to record and to digitize their materials and to share them on their own terms. And this is something that we remain very committed to doing, but it is going to be significantly more difficult. And this is a project that was going to involve colleagues across departments in UCSB, students, and everyone else. And it's just one of something like 1,400 projects that were terminated around the country.
So clearly, journalism is under attack, but so are educational institutions. So I want to ask the whole panel, because clearly it does affect the whole panel. How do we see this infringement on free speech for these institutions translating into what gets preserved in history?
I'll take a stab at that. And my answer is that at least, I think what Juan referred to, like examples of the kinds of projects that are going to be more difficult to fund. But we're not, I don't think we know for sure what are going to be the missed opportunities. We know that there are kind of like concrete projects that were underway that have been canceled. But it's like canceling funding for like the NSF or for the National Institutes of Health. We know in the long term that will mean less innovation, but we can't precisely pinpoint exactly what what we will not have that we would have had if had that funding. And I think the same thing is true with like, well, what will we lose in terms of preservation? We know it will be a lot, but at least from my perspective, not 100% certain what we will lose, but we know that the loss will be immense.
I want to add to that just a little bit. I agree that it's hard to tell exactly what we will lose, but there is something that is specifically under attack, and that is anything that seems DEI. I have a very close friend who is a student researcher at Spelman College, a historically Black university in Atlanta. And she said that the funding for her lab, which is a STEM lab, it's not even humanities or critical race theory or anything like that, is under threat from the Trump administration. So while we don't know exactly what's going to be lost, we can assume that things that are beneficial to or concern Black Americans in any sense, queer Americans any sense, Indigenous Americans, basically any group that is seemed DEI or anti-Trump, will will and is already being disproportionately impacted by things like funding cuts to not just public media, but to academic institutions.
Well, for my final question, I would like to ask everyone just what advice you would give to young historians, journalists, activists working to preserve these histories that are being ignored or actively erased.
I'll go again.
Perfect.
Talk to people that are older than you. Talk to people that are 70 and 80 years old. Genuinely, throughout my time at KCSB and throughout the time producing my documentary about the Black Student Union, North Hall takeover and creation of the Black Studies departments, I've gotten so much information from people who I interviewed for the documentary and for radio shows and things like that. They won't just tell you what happened. They'll tell you what happened in a way that's going to make you care. And they're also going to include details that aren't included in the newspapers, especially again with marginalized people, with people whose stories Trump and a lot of other people don't want to be told. You're going to find details in people's experiences that you can't find in the archive. And through talking to them and recording those conversations, you can create a really important archive. So talk to the older people in your community that were involved in struggles or experiences or projects that you're invested in, would be my advice.
I would agree completely and just say keep trying, don't let them get away with it. Um, One of the things, I think a lot about the uneven promise of technology, but the fact is that it is easier than it has been in the past to record information, to photograph things, to make sound recordings. They may not be, of the quality and of the, that you would like if we had better equipment, if we had better tools, but what we have still allows us to do a great deal, and so we need to keep trying.
Yeah, and definitely, I totally agree um with both of those comments, and I would add that the same tools of information with like the new technologies and social media are also kind of tools to fight back at the same time. And there is still a hunger for history. There is still a hunger for learning about the past. And one of the like things I recently learned that actually historical podcasts are among the most popular, that people really love consuming history through podcasts. There are other opportunities in social media. History books still sell really well. And so I think there are lots of opportunities still to present alternative versions of history, to make sure our voices are heard. But I think they will be, at least in the short to medium term, increasingly kind of outside the academy, more in other parts of the public sphere. And so I think those opportunities are still out there. And I think kind of like creative, imaginative, entrepreneurial students can still take advantage of those opportunities.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Majewski, Professor Kobo, and Ms. Boltman for those amazing, thoughtful answers. Before I open up to the audience for questions, I'd just like to ask Ms. Boltman, where is your documentary screening and when?
Yeah, the documentary screening is 1 week from today on May 22nd at 5 p.m. in the Multicultural Center Theater. At least one of the people who was interviewed in the documentary, the Black Student Union secretary in 1968, will be in attendance, so that'll be really exciting. And I invite everybody to come. We want to get this story out, and I hope you'll laugh and maybe cry along the way.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much again. We can open up to the audience for some questions now. You can type them in the chat also if you don't want to turn on your microphone.
I would jump in with a question while we're seeing if anybody else wants to add one in the chat. I'm particularly the final remarks from everybody, and the aspect of this issue that's really intriguing to me, that I wonder if anybody wants to say anything more about, is this politicization of history. And we all know that history is written by the victors. I was a journalist in Europe after the Cold War, and I covered how, for example, at Holocaust memorial museums in the East Bloc, how all of them were redone and had to be rewritten from a sort of socialism against fascism point of view to a more inclusive point of view, and so on. And yet, I'm just wondering, do we have to wait until 20, 30 years from now? I feel somewhat helpless. Like everything is so polarized in our own era that we have, for example, different language depending which television station you turn on, whether the January 6th people who were jailed are political prisoners or criminals who were guilty of treason and insurrection. And that is such a huge different worldview, and the degree of political polarization right now. So I love that you were talking about how it's up to individuals to get oral histories and to record things on social media and this and that. how many, I mean, what is the threat to us really being able to preserve that? What if we enter an era where those things are wiped out? Or how many years do we have to wait? Like, will my grandchildren get the full picture of what we're living through now? So that's where my mind was going, if anybody wants to comment on that. Professor Cobo, you're smiling. Maybe you have a thought.
Um, I mean, I think that the main thing you can do about this is you know record your story, record your point of view. Like the thing is that the past is constantly is fleeting, right? The present is just a second, is a moment, and things are getting lost, and things are getting things go unrecorded, things are never written down because everyone knows them. So what's the point of writing them? And I think in moments like this, we can take comfort from the fact that this has happened, maybe in different ways, in different scales, as we were discussing. Um, but but we still manage to hold on to these stories and these memories. And so the best thing truly is, I think, to continue to tell them, to continue to record them, to continue to share them. And this is how we preserve them, right? People remember things that matter. And it's up to us, I suppose, to make our current moment, and to make the things that we're going through, and all the people that we observe, and that we whose stories we hear and we know, and so on, to amplify them in the different ways that we can, so that they continue to be told and spoken, and so on. That's really, I think, that the way that this, if we can look at other periods where things were looking bleak, where moments. I mean, I work on my in my I do a lot of things on digital preservation. So my other job, as it were, is 16th century colonial history. This is a period of huge violence, of epidemics that are destroying populations in a couple of generations, of enormous dispossession, of displacement, of all these different things. And yet we still have these stories, and yet we still have these glimpses into this past, and it's imperfect and it's incomplete, and it's frustrating because we would like to know more, but we still have really powerful stories and voices that still speak to us after hundreds of years. And that, to me, is some comfort.
Yeah, and I would put that in like a project I'm working on now about Robert Glenn, who was enslaved as a child, pulled away from his family, eventually able to reunite his family. He told his story about his life as an enslaved person when he was 87 years old in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the Great Depression. And there was like, I don't think he had like a, the sense that he could change the world with his story, but there is something about him in which he intuitively realized his story was still important. It was important to him. It was important for him to tell it, and it gives us incredible like insight many decades after he recorded that interview um, of what it was like to be enslaved, and it's incredibly powerful. And so I completely agree that however we do it, we still have the opportunity to kind of like preserve our own voices, the voices of those around us. We have all sorts of like technologies to record that. And I really think that even though it seems bleak right now, we never know when hearing those voices is going to be important and is going to make a real difference in people's lives.
Okay, perfect. We have a question from the chat from Alex. Right now, with everything going on politically, a lot of people feel angry and discouraged, especially when it comes to whose histories are acknowledged and whose are erased. How can people take that anger and turn it into something productive when it comes to advocating for historical truth?
I'm really inspired by this question because um, I made a video on Instagram when this is my opinion. I was very upset that UCSB had issued a pretty egregious search warrant against student activists from last year that wouldn't have just given the police information about the student activists, but anybody who had any sort of digital footprint had viewed two pro-Palestine Instagram accounts. And I was super mad. And so I made a video and I posted it on Instagram on the account that I used to like promote my radio show. And at the time, that account had like 40 followers because I had just started it. And the video didn't go super viral. It didn't get like a million views, but I was seeing it like be reposted by a lot of my peers and a lot of people I didn't even know and who didn't know me. And so in my opinion, it went like locally viral. It went viral for the people who needed to see it. And I would say when you get mad about something, make something. That's kind of where I put my political anger. I feel a lot of grief, a lot of anger. I speak with people from around the world for my radio show, and hearing their stories brings up a lot of emotions, but telling those stories is kind of the only way I feel like I can not only help myself feel better, but more importantly, help their situation in some sort of way. And like Professor Kobo has illustrated, we have so many ways that we can make media now. I personally have dabbled in radio, I've dabbled in video production, and I've done like short form social media content. And I think basically everybody in our generation has those skills to like sit in front of a camera and post something with a caption that grabs somebody's attention. And we need to use that, especially because I'm graduating, I'm trying to be a journalist, and the jobs are just not there. There are very few opportunities for young emerging journalists, and it's important to tell the stories that you want to be told in the ways that feel accessible to you. So, yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't say, look in to see if you have a community radio station near you that might, take your voice on their airwaves to preserve history. And on that danger point in the chat, you can also be anonymous over the radio, which is great. So, yeah, that's my perspective on that question, and I really resonate with those feelings as well.
And if I could just make one little plug for there are lots of us who are grappling with this problem of how to preserve information. We have a phenomenal resource in the library. We have an entire research data services department whose focus is on how to preserve things sustainably. We have people who are expert in many of the challenges that we're facing, and who are here and able to help and able to consult and able to give you even basic advice. And they're part, of a much broader kind of community online of people who are grappling with this very question. How do we hold on to, we can create all this new sort of media, but how do we hold on to it? How do we preserve it? How do we share it? And this is something that lots of us are grappling with. So, reach out and let's figure it out together.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else anyone would like to add? Well, then I just wanted to say thank you again, Professor Majewski, Professor Kobo, Ms. Boltman. It was such an engaging panel. The recording for this talk will be up on the Humanities and Fine Arts YouTube channel, and a write-up will be up on our website as well. Check out our TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook for all things HFA. And thank you to our audience for being a part of this work too. Keep asking questions, keep remembering, and keep holding on to history. Happy National History Preservation Month. Thank you.